So kia ora everybody and welcome to the Hocken Collections. For any of you that don't know me, my name's Anna Blackman. I'm the head curator of archives here. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Chris Brickell. And Chris is a professor in the Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology department here at Otago. And when he first sent me this paper, he claimed to have started visiting the Hocken in 2020, but I worked out it was actually the year 2000.
That sounds more like it.
Just 20 years.
Just 20 years.
It's a little bit.
That's right.
Yeah, so I returned to work at the Hocken in 2001. So Chris has been a feature in the reading room throughout most of my time here. Yeah. So Chris started visiting the Hocken in the year 2000 when he was a postdoctoral fellow in history at Canterbury. And as he says, he's been pottering around here ever since. His previous books include Mates and Lovers, A History of Gay New Zealand, and Teenagers, The Rise of Youth Culture in New Zealand. And I thought I'd also mention his book, The James Courage Diaries, which was published in 2021, because like the Robert Lord Diaries, the James Courage Diaries are held at the Hocken here. So his most recent book is an edition of Robert Lord's Diaries. It's a collaboration with Vanessa Manhire and Nonita Rees from the Robert Lord Writers Cottage Trust. So some of you might be aware of the tiny little brick house in Titan Street, which is the Robert Lord Writers Cottage. So this project of editing the book is the subject of the talk he is giving this evening, Robert Lord's Public and Private Worlds. And I would just like to point out we've curated a little display in the white cabinet in the foyer. So if you haven't already had a wee look at that, that includes some of the archival resources selected by Chris. So you can have a look on the way out, perhaps. Anyway, it's my pleasure to say welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Kia ora koutou. Hey, welcome along, everyone. So, so this is our latest little treasure of a production. I say it's a treasure because it's full of all sorts of interesting bits and pieces that are here in the Hocken, and also some things that have been sent to us by friends of Robert's. And so Vanessa did sterling work, who's here, take a bow, Vanessa, sterling work at tracking down all manner of people in New Zealand and the US, and we have some of their photographs here, and parts of the introduction of the book have also got a number of things that our friends have sent us through. So yeah, it's a lovely kind of collaboration. Okay, so beginning, I guess, with this wee timeline, just to orient you in terms of where kind of Robert was and what he was doing at various points. So he was born in Rotorua in 1945, and his first play that was staged, It Isn't Cricket, was staged in 1971, which is the year I was born, but actually this is not all about me. And in 1974, he attended the Eugene O'Neill Playwrights Conference in Waterford, Connecticut, and that sort of gave him an in into the American playwriting scene. He was also very much involved in the social life of New York, where he moved in 1945. In 1987, so he moved backwards and forwards between New Zealand and the US pretty much constantly through those kind of intermediate years. He hated flying, but he did a lot of it anyway. He held the Robert Burns Fellowship in 1987, and I've got his official kind of Robert Burns Fellowship photo here to show you. He bought the cottage at number 3 Titan Street, which Anna mentioned in her introduction. I've got a photo of that as well, just at the time he bought it. Died in Dunedin of HIV, AIDS-related complications in 1992, before his most successful play was staged in later in that year. I think it was about 6 weeks later, Joyful and Triumphant, which is regarded as his most important kind of piece of work. But
audio is great.
Oh, audio is great. Excellent. So I surprised the people at Otago University Press in providing this rather unlikely photograph of Robert from what we know of his later life as a rejecter of social conformity. In fact, here on the left in the front row of the rugby team. I think the team was 4B, so I presume that means fourth form team B, but I'm not entirely sure. So here you can see a very young Robert, but you could see tall, right, even then, sitting here on the left-hand side. So Robert went to high school in Hamilton and then in Invercargill at Southland Boys High. Hamilton, he found particularly bewildering. He said, it's so incomprehensible and irrelevant were the activities that surrounded me that I frequently retreated to a fantasy world where I wrote my own reality. And I chose this quote because the writing and rewriting of reality, including his own story, is something which Robert Lord did throughout his life in a really interesting kind of way. And there are 8 diaries that form the basis of Robert Lord Diaries, the book. And the book is sitting in the cabinet out there, if you haven't seen it. I know some of you have had a bit of a look, so that's pretty exciting. And those diaries plus a range of other bits and pieces. So he grew up in provincial New Zealand, and this informed his playwriting. He then moved to Wellington in about 1969. Where he became involved in the theatre scene, including downstage theatre in Wellington, which is now Hannah Playhouse. I don't think it's the Downstage Theatre Company anymore. So he became involved in the theatre in about 1971. He'd been involved with on and off with some kind of productions, including a film he made when he was worked on when he was teaching at the Tony school in 1969. 1969, he also wrote a story called Mrs. Weave, which won the Catherine Mansfield Young Writers Award. And this is a really fabulous wee piece of writing. It's a very atmospheric short story about a 68-year-old woman's lonely life in the country and her home help who goes mad, and kind of her moving backwards and forwards on the bus through the kind of countryside in a way that reminds me very, very much of Janet Frame and her writing, of which a little bit more shortly. In 1972, he met and fell in love with Russell Craig, and here's a photo of Russell at the Rolling Stones concert in 1973. He said, I met Russell in 1972 when I lived in Wellington. It was Tony Taylor's house. Now, Tony Taylor went on to direct some of Robert Lord's plays. I remember thinking he was the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. I wanted to be with him from the moment I first laid eyes on him, which is something of a cliched situation. I was rather doughy and intense, garrulous too, and occasionally amusing in those days. So here's doughy and intense Robert sitting on the veranda of a flat in Clifton Terrace in Wellington, 1972. Those of you who are familiar with Wellington may be familiar with Clifton Terrace, and if you're not directly, you might remember it as a stop on the cable car on the way up. So this was a kind of a flat full of people who came and went. All sorts of interesting characters went through here. There was a group of hippies lived in the living room for a while, and Robert really hated them, and they made kind of jandals out of ties and other things he found a bit irksome. And then lots of crayfishes, which his friend loaded into the fridge. So it was actually quite an interesting time. Quite an experimental time for Robert too. So he fell in love with Russell, but he did have at least 2 girlfriends at that around that kind of time too. So a really interesting kind of life, and he talks about the intense kind of experimentation of that time in Wellington. So think about 72, it's the year gay liberation arrived in New Zealand, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. It's the time second wave feminism really got going in New Zealand, and this informed some of his plays. I may have time to mention that as well. So his plays, I want to talk not about It Isn't Cricket, which is a really good and innovative play, but it's not one of the ones I've focused on in my own kind of pottering around with his plays. There are 3 I want to talk about now, and some more I want to talk about later, which no one would ever have heard of because they're in the Hocken, but no one ever put them on, and they're kind of cool. So I want to talk about those. So this is a little preamble. He said, my homosexuality and the fact that I could not let it find expression within my family led me into strange avenues. If I'd been born in America, I think I would not have found it necessary to enter the theatre. So like so many people, the theatre was a space of experimentation for all manner of New Zealanders who wanted to get away from the expectations of what they often experienced to be quite a conformist society. Lord had very strong views about the likes of Robert Muldoon and the National Party, and this was not a New Zealand he revelled in, although it was the New Zealand of his parents and his parents' friends. And I think this is quite significant that you'll see as I chat about the plays that there's a real sense of tension with Robert around what does conformity mean in New Zealand? What does suburbia mean in New Zealand? What's the nuclear family? And what is all this about? At that time of both conservative governments, of course, Kirk's Labour government in the early 70s, Muldoon in the later 70s, and a time of kind of these new social movements. All right, so thinking of the theatre as an escape, a place to try new things, a place to be new people and to write new characters that offer a way of taking us out of the world in which we live. We may need to retreat to that again now. This is part of the program for It Isn't Cricket, and I love this so much, this 1970s-ness. If you're a fan of retro stuff, my mum who's listening will say, I lived it the first time, I don't want to live it a second time. But if you do want to live it a second time, it's in the cabinet just out there. So this is entirely possible. Okay, so Vanessa's here, obviously sitting in the middle, but our other editor, Nonita Rees, is actually here. So Nonita acted in Meeting Place along with Tony Ditchburn and Craig Ashley and Susan Wilson. So this play had 2 female characters, 2 male characters. The characters were ostensibly heterosexual, but as you kind of unpick and dig your way through the play, it starts to become rather more complicated. And I had coffee with Nonita a wee while back, and she said Tony Ditchburn, who was himself gay, kind of saw the kind of queer undertones to it, but the public didn't always. So this wee piece of dialogue, I'm fine, you can stop, you're very sensual, admit it, you like touching, was part of the really intense relationship between the 2 women. The 2 men have a very interesting relationship. Arthur and Paul were best friends growing up. Paul clearly is a difficult, complicated character. There's a gay bashing in the play. He invites another guy back to his flat and beats him up and leaves him bloody and kicks him out onto the footpath. And Paul then undergoes this process of, as he says, feeling really distant from himself. And the next slide has got the quote where he talks about this. So Paul, who I think was played by Craig Ashley on the left, Paul says, when I observed myself closely, I could see myself living. I would remain outside of myself and observe. I would remain outside and watch the body living. The more I observed the bodies, the more the body seemed strange, the less familiar it appeared. The body something responded, I think. The body had become a stranger. I was outside. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's awesome. This is experimental technology tonight, folks. So we're kind of, getting the boxes in the right place. The body responded, but the body had become a stranger. I was outside. And the play, so much of the play is about Paul's alienation from himself. And in this, you can read Robert's alienation from elements of his own society, that sense of different forms of New Zealand, liberal New Zealand's outsiderness in relation to conservative New Zealand, and that sense of not quite being in yourself, which was very much an experience of queer people in New Zealand at that time. This was a time, of course, when sex between men was illegal. So Robert was quite brave writing these themes. That some of the reviewers picked up this kind of really persistent kind of undertow, even at that point. Two more plays I just want to mention quickly. One is Glitter and Spit, which was put on a wee while ago here in Dunedin at the Athenaeum. And this is very much one where people swap places. So the character who appears to be queer ends up in a straight relationship, and the really conservative straight guy ends up in a tutu, and his former girlfriend thinks this is fabulous, and his current wife thinks it's outrageous and calls him a pervert. So the whole kind of starting point gets twisted and inverted, and this is very much a kind of a Robert Lord kind of theme. So in terms of public and private lives, he was presenting his private life or elements of it in the public, and there was an interaction between these two things. Okay, now the last play I want to talk about right now is Balance of Payments. Now, this was also put on in Dunedin, and Bronwyn Wallace, who is on Zoom at the moment, hi Bronwyn, was involved in putting this on. This is the most extraordinary thing. This is the craziest play, and I love it. I love it so much. Hi Bronwyn. So, Balance of Payments is about Mabel and Max. The parents here is Mabel here. Mabel and Max make a living out of prostituting their son in the saunas and swimming pools of urban New Zealand. He's not massively successful, even though he poses in a little costume that his mother had knitted him. He brings home $8 one day and accuses his mother of being unfaithful with a man called Curvy in a parking building elevator, of all things. And his mother's furious and stabs him to death with her knitting needles. He's got to make a story of how to cover his tracks. The vicar arrives to say that he thinks that, in fact, her daughter is being prostituted out as well. The mother knows this because she's the one who sent the daughter out. And so she shoots the vicar with her pistol. And then he's lying in front of the fireplace on top of the son, who's also lying by the fireplace, having been disposed of. And then a client of her son arrives, and so she shoots him with a pistol as well. So he's piled on top of the other two bodies by the fireplace, and the play ends. What's not to like? And so it's a kind of a commentary again on suburban New Zealand. Now, who's familiar with A State of Siege by Janet Frame? Yeah. I've only started reading it and I got a bit lost. So State of Siege is about Melfred Signal. And I think that this is just the best name in the whole world. This is Robert Lord's, obviously. Melfred Signal is trapped in a batch on I think Waiheke Island is where Frame lived when she wrote this. And there's a stranger knocking at the door, and I don't think she ever answers the door. I didn't get that far. So this idea of people being trapped in the kind of lives they live in was a Frame theme, and it was also a Lord theme. So it's not surprising this was a kind of a cool double bill at Unity Theatre, a left-wing theatre in Wellington. All right. So the conformity of suburban existence and the suburban hellscape, which I called it in the book's introduction, is what sort of, Lord was interested in. Okay, next one. That's him, of course. But what about the role of the theatre? So Lord suggested theatre need not be revolutionary, but I think that theatre today can heighten the perception of the individual about himself, his community, and other people. So Lord did see the theatre as doing something in terms of poking and prodding the kind of way that we might think about our own lives and the society around us. This is Jill Andre and Ben Masters in a reading of a play called Dead and Never Called Me Mother, which he put on as a workshop in Waterford in Connecticut in 1975. This play also had Meryl Streep in it, so that's the Meryl Streep connection. Okay, so the diaries that I'm going to talk a bit more about next, because I want to talk about his life in the US before coming back a bit to New Zealand. So this is what they look like. The Canton College one is in the cabinet, so you can have a look at that. It's not a startling object in its own right. Some of the diaries are written in these are the two best ones. The others are stacks of paper, basically. So that gives you an idea what the diaries are like. So in 1974, he went to the US on a travel bursary. In 1975, he moved to the US, lived in New York. This is him in 1975. An observation on the American way of life: it's hot, and people prance with such flair, he said. On to New York, which is so dirty I cannot describe it, but vital and alive. And I stayed in Brooklyn, loud and hot and scary. So he was quite he was scared of New York initially, and then said he learned how to live with it. He learned how to navigate subways, and he found his way into this very lively social life. Roger Hall, in his obituary of Lord, says Lord met all the famous people. He met people like Meryl Streep before she became famous, Christopher Lloyd before he became famous, and others. It was quite a lively kind of life, as you're going to see in a moment. And just a warning, I do have a couple of slightly X-rated quotes from his diaries, which you may or may not like, but you're going to get them anyway. Right. Oh, this is talking about hot. Yeah, it's quite hot. It's lovely. I'm not going to complain. It's been so bloody freezing here. This is. I think he might have been in Vermont at this point. He used to go away and do play readings and play workshops, but his parents were regional New Zealanders. They were more conservative in outlook, and Robert hid his queer life in the US from them quite a lot. And he says, am I going to tell them I danced my life away, that I'm a disco maven, that I'm a faggot slut who behaved like a whore during her last weeks in New York and now wonders if she has an anal infection? And he said, no, I will lie, he said. So he was really kind of, there were two lives. There was the American life and his New Zealand family life, and I guess there was the New Zealand theatre life, which was a bit more kind of integrated. So Robert's New York Diaries read like Tales of the City. Who's a Tales of the City fan? Armistead Maupin's book about, like me, Jeffrey and I are. We've even had a look around the spots in San Francisco where this series of books are set. It's really cool. It's about gay San Francisco during the 1970s and 80s. Lord was a fan of Maupin's work. So Lord's own New York companions, that like Maupin's, they partied, they hung out in cafes and clubs, they smoked hash in the streets in the early hours of the morning. Robert wandered aimlessly around the city, shooting the breeze with friends equally underemployed, he said. And he walked his beagle Becky, and you're going to get to see Becky. Becky is very adorable. And he and his friends made soup for the sex workers who plied their trade around the bottom of his apartment building. So it's actually kind of that kind of integrated kind of life too, in a sense. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to his friends. Okay, so a friend on the left, we don't know who that is. If anyone does, let us know. Vanessa and Non and I have been discovering people as we've kind of gone along. And then on the right, this is a 1985 picture, captioned by Robert, herself attired for receiving, obvious double entendre, Madonna Madness Party in 1985. I wasn't sure why he was dressed like this. If you, like me, you are curious, go and watch Madonna's Like a Virgin video, and this will become absolutely clear as to why he's dressed like this. She's dressed in a massive kind of meringue wedding dress, and it's quite slightly gothic as far as Madonna does gothic, and meringue and great. And so this is just a tablecloth stuffed into his pants, right? But I'm sure the Madonna Madness Party must have been quite a lot of fun. Okay, it must be time just about to introduce you to Gary Liss. Here is Gary Liss, who was a really good friend of Robert's in New York. Gary was known as Granny. And there were some raunchy kind of quotes about Granny. I can see you looking slightly anticipatious. Whether it's in a good way or not, I'm not entirely sure. One of the diaries begins thus. Yesterday I had breakfast with Gary Liss, and we were both feeling like shit and somewhat suicidal. After leaving the American, we went up to her house and had coffee, and there was very sepulchral music on the radio, and she showed me some Pablo Neruda poetry, which I copied down, and that put me in a very weird frame of mind, or confirmed the one I was already in. Saturday slept late and Granny came over and we worked on a fashion column he has to write, and that quite wore my mind out, and God knows what it was about, I don't. Then off to Melvin B's and Silent Steve's for dinner. Steve was silent, the dinner excellent. A brief encounter on 80th Street, which was jolly and got my rocks off, and now off with Granny to see Slides of Singapore. Which Vanessa and I think is absolutely, completely, utterly hilarious, and we're not quite sure why this is. But I guess the incongruity of this and then watching Slides of Singapore, perhaps, is quite fun. A party at Linda Stein's at which everyone drank too much cheap wine, causing Granny to be very ill on Sunday afternoon. Clams had to put a Bible on her stomach. And we're going to see clams quite shortly. Vanessa managed to solve the mystery of clams. This is Gary Granny on the left and Bobby Miller on the right. Bobby Miller is magnificent. Bobby is still alive in New York and shared the previous photo and this photo and another few photos with us. And so some of Bobby's photos are in the book, and Vanessa tried to contact Bobby, but then couldn't, but then the universe delivered Bobby into her, pretty much, through John Kelly. Okay, yep. Friday lunch as usual with Granny Liz and a brief run over all the gossip, and now I've decided to write a book called September about everything that happens to me that month and tie in all the members of the family and their fucked up lives. Okay. These are some of the members of Granny, Gary and Robert's New York family. Photographs courtesy of the magnificent Bobby Miller. Jack Hofsis, whom Robert called Jackie O'Hofsis, which I still giggle at how clever that actually is. Keith Edmondson, who was known as Clams, and the diaries had Clams, and we weren't sure for the longest time who Clams was, and then we managed to find Clams, so that was like enormously exciting. Keith Edmondson. Robbie LaFosse, who's still alive. Did you correspond with Robbie? So Robbie's still around, and Peter Buckley, known as Mother, who is not still around. So this was his family, and the diaries will often talk about the family. Jay Funk. Took us a while to track down Jay Funk. Jay is one of my favourite of Robert's friends. They were lovers in the late 1970s and then became close friends for many, many years afterwards, although Robert found Jay immensely frustrating. He also really adored him. Find it hard to explain to anyone about Jay at all. Is it jealousy on my part? I can't believe he doesn't love me, but I know he loves me, but he doesn't want to be my lover. And then there's nothing else I can do about that, or is there? I cannot be angry because he's honest. Am I hurt, or is it just my pride? Did I love him too much? Do I always love too much? Is that my flaw? This is Robert, right? People who knew him often see him as quite confident, but the diaries show this tentative person kind of working his way through, working out who he is, what his work is, what it's worth, what he is worth. Am I good enough? I guess a diary is often somewhere we confide in ourselves, and James Courage's diary is very much like that. I did a bit for North and South in the December issue about the similarities between those two, and there are quite a lot. It was quite interesting once I started. In the afternoon, Jay came by and wanting me to get some acid for him from Terry. Well, I did the phoning, and Jay, Alex and I walked down to Terry's, and I picked up 15 half moons, and we're going to meet Alex shortly. But Jay, you can see, Robert talks about one day he's about to come back to New Zealand. He's completely stressed out of his mind, and Jay is the one who looks after him. Jay is the one who calms him down, and Jay is the one who takes him shopping at Bloomingdale's to buy stuff for Robert's nephew and niece. He is a good man. And I love this bit so much because you have the sense of Jay being immensely frustrating early on, and actually he turned out to be, they turned out to be so close. Alex, of whom more in a moment, when he wrote to us, he said, Alex used to be Jay's best friend from high school, and he said Robert was older than the two of them and persuaded them to develop themselves. And as Alex said, Robert really pushed us to develop our creative natures. Robert pushed Alex to become a photographer and do a photography course, and Alex, and you'll see some of his images, Alex was a photographer and is still. So Robert was immensely important in encouraging others in his community to develop their talents. Gary Liss, as you'll see in a moment, was a costume designer. Among other things, he was later on an academic. And so Robert was not only his own creativity, but he was really encouraging others to develop theirs as well. Here's Alex. So here's Alex the eel, Ely, thin and slippery on 57th Street. This is not in the book, so this is a bonus photo. Then here's Alex here in his photographic studio. Some of you would have seen the photo of Robert. I don't have it on the slide, but it's got him with his hand over his mouth, and that's the photo that's in the cottage. Alex took those photos in New York in 1985. So Alex helped to solve the mystery of where those photos had come from. There's another set of headshots which Alex took out by Dunedin Airport after he had visited. So Alex, Jay, and Robert were really close. Bobby and Alex think, if you contact them now, they'll say how much they love Robert and how important he was to them and to their lives. Now I'm feeling slightly mournful that really amazing photo on the left is not in the book, but as the poor Hocken staff discovered, particularly poor Judith, I was just finding things at the last minute. Jeffrey was saying to me, you have to stop somewhere. And I was like, no. And I come in here and I say to Judith, is there any chance one more sneaky photo order to be processed in 3 days before the book goes to print? She said, yes, there is. So I was quite happy about that. The Hocken staff were amazing. Honestly, how you put up with me in my last minute photo orders, I have absolutely no idea. But thank you.
Van coming.
Here's Becky. I promised you some Becky. Becky is adorable. Robert adored her. So she lived in New York when Robert wasn't there. She lived with friends. There's another photo of her later. This is her at Fire Island, where he spent a lot of time. She'd just returned from an exhausting 11 days on Fire Island with Jack Hosses, Peter Buckley, Doug Watts, Larry Smith, Jim Rose, and Peter Fonseca, and Paddy and Buddy Ferraro. We had a new 4-bedroom pool house which shook every time someone breathed, and the pool, about 3 foot deep at best, leaked. Lots of drugs and disco and a little sex, strange emotional vibrations as our lives intermingle. 6 of us drove to the beach with 20 pieces of luggage. While we were there, went to several parties. Returned to New York City to the news that David Jawari was killed in a fire in the Holiday Inn, fell 14 floors to his death. Oh, I am so poor, but at least I am alive, writes Robert. So he's got this quite arch kind of sense of humour, which is a real kind of element of the diaries. Apropos of nothing at all, here's Robert on Dumbo at Disneyland. This is also not in the book, so it's also a bonus photo. There's a whole set of him and his friends at Disneyland, and if I'd had 2 hours, I would have gone through very slowly and showed you all of them, but I mustn't, so I'm not going to. I'm going to tell you now a little bit about 2 plays. I have realised that I've not read out the one New York thing I was going to read out. Okay. You'll probably never invite me back again. This is a story about Sally, not her real name. Early one Sunday, out on the deck, Sally was making out with all and sundry, including Granny Liss, and decided to fuck Granny, which delighted that queen. So Sally is off to the bedroom to strap on the dildo, and Jack gets out of bed to watch. Meantime, the phone goes, and Martine Van Hamel is asking Granny to design a costume for some new ballet. So when Sally emerges from the bedroom with the dildo strapped into place, Granny is planning to drape this here and that there and went out on another plane altogether. Sally looks at dear Granny, who has obviously forgotten she was going to get fucked, says fuck, pulls at a toggle, and the dildo crashes to the floor. Don't know how I forgot to tell you that one. Greg,
Are enriched.
oh, I think so. Greg is with me on the Otago University Press board, and I said to Greg, I don't know if I should include this wee piece in the book proposal when it went before the board. And he said, yes, you really must. But I didn't. It's all right, I accepted the book. Now, these two plays here are probably not known about at all. One is on a weekday in summer. And this is a story about a married couple, and the husband is in love with one of his male friends, and he married for money. He tries to drown his wife so he can be with his male lover. The wife is not drowned and comes back and then demands that he kills his male lover or she's going to the police. And then he kills his male lover and she threatens him anyway, declares she's going to marry a man named Tony. Tony doesn't want to marry her, so she shoots him. And then somehow it comes to some kind of conclusion. And as Lord says, Tony slumps forward with an appropriate spurting of blood. And I think someone should put this play on. It's kind of cool. Like, it starts really slowly and then it becomes this kind of splatter movie of a play. Lord loved killing. He had strangling. He had drowning. He had shooting. He had knitting, needling, obviously. And there's a real Joe Wharton kind of element to some of his plays, that sort of real black kind of humour. He calls his play China Wars a black comedy, but it's nowhere near as black as some of the others. And next one is a play called Overture. And I think this is really interesting because most of his plays are set in suburbia, and suburbia is a hellscape for Robert, right? But Overture is set in the city. It's set in Central Park in New York. And it's about two men. It's called a 4-minute play, and it's less than 4 pages. It's incredibly short. And it basically tells an encounter between two unnamed men. One of them is there cruising for sex, and the other one turns up and claims he's studying the trees for his art study. And the other one realises that this first guy who's claiming to be studying the oak trees must be completely a faker because the trees are elms and not oaks. So you've got to know your trees or you get into trouble in these places. The first man asks, I couldn't help but notice you were looking in my direction. Do you find me sexually attractive? I had the feeling you were undressing me with your eyes. And then he speaks of his own sexual experience with evident exaggeration. I had love like Julio. I swear one look from Julio could bring me to the point of ejaculation. And this all seems a bit much, and as does some of the dialogue in China Wars, until you realise that Robert spent years and years and years as a typesetter for a porn magazine. This was one of his other jobs. And so he absorbed this kind of endless dialogue that he spent many years and years doing. He also worked as a real estate agent on Fire Island. He worked in a bookstore. And as well as being a playwright and later on in his life writing film scripts, few of which actually ever turned out to translate into an actual film. When the first man declares the trees are not in fact oaks, but are in fact Dutch elms, his new companion relents, declares, I'm ready now, and returns to the first man's apartment. So this is how you do it in Central Park. And so this is really interesting because in Meeting Place, the apartment is a place of violence. Suburbia is a place of repression. But in this little short play, the park is a place of puncturing the untruths, people coming to what they actually do want and then meeting a resolution, which very few of his other plays do. Mostly they end up with people deluding themselves and others and ending up in terrible trouble or ending up dead, right? So this is this is quite different. Bert and Maisy and Joyful and Triumphant, as many of you will know, are not like that at all. But there's this whole other kind of strand to Robert's playwriting where they are much more kind of Austen-esque, including his early kinds of plays. Okay, so back to New Zealand. Here's his mum, Bibi, and Robert in the Central Plateau in 1981. They did a trip from Auckland down through the Central Plateau, down the North Island, and then around the South Island. And this is one of the most interesting and fascinating parts of that particular diary, because he's really thinking about, what is New Zealand? What does New Zealand mean to me? What is this place? And it becomes really clear that he found New Zealand quite restricting growing up, but he's immensely attached to it. And even though he spent most of his time in the North Island, he absolutely loved the South Island. And every time friends visit, whether they were famous actors, Joyce Reeling visited, Jay Funk visited, and he'd take them all around on this tour. Gilbert Parker, a New York agent, visited. And he just loved that kind of countryside and that sense of the New Zealand, the physicality of New Zealand landscape, if not necessarily the relationships that kind of happened in there. He says, I love it here, so clean and empty and powerful. This is where I identify with New Zealand most, yet it is not really where I come from, the Lower South Island. But it speaks to me and I feel at peace. And so I really kind of love that. He says, I've thought of Jay a lot these past few days and wish he was with me as these travels unfold, but it's not so. But in fact, Jay visited subsequently for another visit. Then on to Te Puke and the family. Much beer, drinking and laughter and total exhaustion on my part. Now, this bit's a bit mean, but I can't resist it. You possibly see why. Have recently begun to think that Dad lacks adequate intellectual stimulation, which is why the long discourses, the intense concern about money, business and politics, the intensely close scrutiny of every paper. And anyone who lives on a diet of New Zealand papers is sure to become intellectually troubled. So there you go. Here he is. This is an Alex Ely photo, Milford Sound. One of the recent pieces of publicity called it a selfie, which it isn't. It's a photo by Alex, but it's almost got a sort of a selfie quality to it, which looks forward to the way we would engage with the landscape now, which I think that misapprehension is actually quite nice. These are colour slides. I mean, you can see how intense they are. Alex sent these to us very soon before the book went to print, so we were taking photos out and then taking things out and putting this in. So in fact, due to some of the work that you did do was like, no, not that one, we want this. Not being fussy, but okay. This is why the knitting machine really needed to stay in the 1980s. I saw that first one on the left and I thought, this is not going in the book. It went in the book. And then we found the one on the right, which Alex took, and it is not in the book. And I wanted this one in the book, but we'd run out of pages. Couldn't have that. So this is a bonus just for you.
You know who knitted the jersey?
I don't think that should ever be known. No. I like the mountains hovering, perfection. So one of his many trips around New Zealand. I better quickly move on. Someone may want the jersey. Bert and Maisy is one of his most well-known plays. It was made into at least one film to a television series. He was going to line it up for another television series and then another one and another one and another one and then another film and another film, another television series, but actually thankfully he stopped. Bert and Maisy is quite well known. I actually really like this play. I wasn't necessarily expecting to like it, but it works around a kind of a very that was going to happen. Never mind. Bert and Maisy, and they live in their house, and Bert goes and meets people at the railway station because that's where you meet interesting people. So here's Tom. He discovers Tom in the railway station. Shona and Grant do not approve. They think it's appalling you would find a young man at the railway station and then bring him in to make your life more cheerful. which he essentially did. Yeah, actually, I usually spill the water, so there's not so that sense of what is respectable, what is respectable kind of conformity, and ultimately, and what happens when someone comes in and actually queers or upturns the suburban social order. So there are transgressive elements in this play. It ends up where Shona and Grant take over the house, and Bert and Maisy go and live in someone's garret or basement or something. And you think that Shona and Grant have won. Tom leaves, and then Bert goes back to the railway station. So, okay, prizes for who can guess who the actor is on the left.
Alice.
It is Alice.
Yes. Can't remember. Alice Fraser.
This is Alice Fraser, a good old stalwart. Ray Henwood is in some of his plays. Numerous well-known circa people acted in great many of his plays. Tom in this photo is played by John Brazier, and the caption on the back of the photo is, "I thought she was going to wet herself." That's just happened, but it happened. All right. Well, I am absolutely on the home straight now. This is the cottage, and so was discovered again in the Hocken, of course, this magnificent little collection of photos from the cottage from when it was bought. You can see the real estate agent's sign is still in the window. Robert bought this near the end of his 1987 year of the Burns Fellow, and I told you I was going to show you the picture of him, and that's a complete lie because actually it's not on the PowerPoint at all. He described this in his diary as the smallest house in the southern hemisphere, if not the world.
It's in a street called Taylor.
Ironically enough.
Yes.
Many of you will have been into the cottage or know of the cottage or be trustees of the cottage. It's got a corridor running down one side, and then there's a front room, bedroom, and then the back has a dining room, kitchen, and then there's a laundry, toilet, and a shower for a very tall person out the back. The shower for a very tall person, of course, is for Robert, and he had that put in there. There was an open day fairly recently. If you haven't been and had a look, the next open day, I can highly recommend it. So he lived in another flat in Dunedin for a while, which I believe to be on the site of the Centre for Innovation. Is about as close as I can get to where I think that was. Yeah. Before he bought this cottage. I've got another one of the cottage. So that's the inside of the front room. That's a photograph sneakily taken by me when Anita wasn't looking, and it is in the book. So I just want to talk just at the end, before questions, a little bit about the bit that I found quite tricky in terms of the book, which is writing about Robert's death and the time quite close to Robert's death. So he learned about the spread of AIDS, which he initially called gay cancer in New York in 1981, and then he watched as friends died from it. Many of his close friends, including Jay and Gary and Clams, died of AIDS in the 1990s, as Lord would himself. He was quite opaque about his own HIV diagnosis in the diaries, and as you may or may not have heard Non's interview with Kim Hill on Radio New Zealand, which was a really fantastic interview, in which Non was saying that there are signs in the diaries that he was receiving medication and sometimes having trouble getting medication long before he actually talked about being HIV positive. So he didn't sort of come out with it. And then later on, he was talking about, how do I tell people? What do I say to my friends? Sorry, I'm about to kick the bucket. Like, how do I even acknowledge it and talk about it? And he talks about being with his extended family, and they would complain about their gout, and then he would be sitting there thinking, well, actually, I'm going to die. So it was, a fairly intense kind of time There's some disagreement among those who knew him about the extent to which he talked about AIDS privately. He didn't really talk about it publicly. He did go to a consciousness raising thing at one point in Dunedin, but he thought it was not interesting. It was not political enough. It was too therapeutic or something like that. So there's still sort of degrees of opacity around the extent to which he talked about it. Jay, going back to Jay for a moment, was really interesting. We learn more about Jay through Alex and through other kind of ways. After Jay had been with Robert, he became a Christian missionary of sorts, and he went to Kansas for a while. That turned out to be the only time when he didn't flat with Alex, so he lived with Alex for most of his life. But Jay reoriented his zeal away from Christian missionizing to AIDS activism. And so Jay became an AIDS activist and became involved with ACT UP, I think, in New York. So a really interesting kind of shift in terms of his kind of own advocacy. Okay, so I've just got 2 more slides, but I more or less got to the point where I wanted to get to. So I had to show you another photo of Becky. So here are Robert and Becky from New York from 1977, and Robert took Becky in to work with him. I'm assuming this is the typesetters. This looks very much like there's rows of text and so on. You see it better in the close-up photograph, but it's such a poignant, beautiful photo of the pair of them. It's in the front of the book. And he was in New Zealand at one point, said, I wish I had Becky here. I miss the little angel. So yeah, Becky was a very important part of his life too. All right. So I'm just going to finish on the slide that says thoughts and questions. This is actually a piece of the program and or poster of Heroes and Butterflies, another play of Robert's, one I've read, but not sort of analysed in any kind of detail. And this artwork was produced by Russell Craig, one of Robert's early lovers who I mentioned before, and it's really kind of mystical and lovely. And they come in at least 2 different colourways. So there was a blue version and a mauve version, and I think there may have been another as well. I'm not sure. Okay, so thank you, everyone. On that note, I'm going to stop and see if there are any thoughts or questions.